Alright, welcome back to the Newark SOP tower section. This is the second video, and this is going to be specifically about VFR procedures in the Skyline route. So I'm going to run through the SOP a little bit, what it says in here, the important things in here, and then I'm just going to open up VRC, kind of draw out some of the things. So first we're just going to talk about departures. Anyone who's going to one of these N90 airports, go to New York metros, we need to APREC them before they can take off. To make sure that the destination tower can take them. So you just coordinate this with whatever the tower is or whoever's whoever's covering the tower, because a lot of times you might have, like, let's say they were going to Islip, right, and Cameron was online. Then they typically cover the Islip sector if Islip is not online. So just make sure you coordinate, see if one controller's not online, make sure that no one's covering it, so you can send them or coordinate as needed. For the next section B, I'm going to clear this up a little bit later because to some extent I agree with this, and to some extent I need to elaborate on this. So aircraft should be given the most expeditious way out of the airspace, which should be away from the IFR flow. That's true to some extent. You want to keep them away from your IFR people, but that doesn't mean you can't use the same flow. So I'll explain that and draw that out a little bit later and explain by what I mean by that, because it really does depend on the situation, what the aircraft's doing, what your IFR flow is looking like. For Skyline route departures, remember from the clearance delivery section that they were not given an initial altitude in their clearance, so this has to be given at some point in their takeoff clearance. So there's sort of two main ways I like to approach the takeoff clearance. There's either you're giving them an instruction before they join the Skyline route, or you're giving them an instruction to join the Skyline route. So, for example, you could give them a heading and an altitude, and then the typical runway whatever, wind whatever, runway whatever, clear for takeoff. Or you could give them proceed direct, typically it would be the statue, and then join the Skyline route, all in one. So this can depend on a couple factors. It depends on if you have traffic in the airspace. It can depend on what runway you're using, and other things as well, depending on if the aircraft's comfortable with the airspace. They might not know the Skyline very well, and so just saying on departure, proceed direct the statue would not be very smart. But here is the phraseology for both. This is if you're just giving them a heading, and then once they're on the heading and the traffic permitting, you can have them proceed direct the statue, assuming they can see it and everything. And then the second example is doing it all in one. So on departure, they're going to proceed direct the statue, join the Skyline route, and it has the altitude, all that. It's a really long one, but it kind of gets everything wrapped up in one nice package. The only thing I'd like to note is, especially for runway 11, even though we don't run runway 11 typically, we talked about that before, you can still use 11 as long as you coordinate it and the aircraft's okay with it. Because especially for Skyline route departures, if the winds are advantageous towards 11, then it's a very good tool, because the runway heading off runway heading off 11 is basically direct the statue. So that means other traffic in the area, as long as you depart them well and don't conflict with other departures either off the 22s or the 4s, as long as you do your job well, it's really easy to just get them out runway heading, or even direct the statue right off 11, because right in front of them is the statue. Let's take a break from the Skyline route for a little bit, and just talk about flight following, overflights, pound work, all that good stuff. So for flight following, we already talked about it. We're ARTS and LRAC certified, so whenever someone's in Newark Towers portion of the Bravo, or they would like flight following through any part of Tower's airspace, they're going to radar identify them if they're not already, and keep the track until they're leaving the airspace, in which case they'd hand off to the next controller, be it could be a tower controller, it could be a departure controller, it could be an approach controller, whatever. Or you could, if they didn't want flight following and they're leaving the Bravo, you could just switch over to Unicom. For overflights and 11/29 arrivals, because typically some arrivals may request 11 or 29 even if you're not running it, because it's, first of all, it's closer to the GA ramp, second of all, it might be easier to get in than behind a jet, and let's say maybe even the winds are slightly favoring it even if we're not running it. So when someone's arriving to 9 or 11, you can typically just have them act as an overflight and then join either the left or right base for the runway. So here are good diagrams for that. If someone's just an overflight, typically you'll just send them direct the numbers for whichever runways we're running. So if we're on the 4s, send them direct the 4s numbers. If we're on the 2-2, send them direct the 2-2s. And then they're going to overfly the field at 1500. Now, this is not a set in stone, has to be 100% of the time rule, but this is typically a good recommendation for what to do. If you don't think this would be advantageous for a specific situation, it's your discretion. Just make sure you're doing everything safely and you're keeping the needed separation and giving traffic calls as needed. But again, if it's a 11/29 arrival, you could do the same thing, proceed direct one of the numbers, and then have them turn and either enter a final or a base for runway 11 or 29. And it's all sort of shown in here. For pattern work, it's pretty simple. Every runway is going to be left traffic, and the different altitudes are just depending on the aircraft type. Let's see. And then the rest of this is again on the Skyline route, but this is more of an overview on what the Skyline route is, where it is, and the surrounding airspace. So this is a really good diagram of it for the altitude-wise, and this is a good diagram for how aircraft will fly on the left side versus the right. So if they're going northbound, they're going to basically it's like you're driving on the right. So the northbound's going to stay on the east side, southbound's going to stay on the west side. And if you look at the altitude delegation here, you'll see the Class Bravo airspace. It says it up, up here as well. But the altitude that is in the Bravo that Newark Tower owns is 1,301 to 2,000 feet. So that means anything below here is actually all uncontrolled. So it's broken down into two sections from 1,001 feet to 1,300 feet. This is for overflight traffic, so this is in the special flight rules area. It's for people who don't want to get a Bravo clearance, don't want to talk to any air traffic control, but want to transition the Hudson northbound or southbound, they'll fly in this area. And then below that, 1,000 feet and below, this is more local traffic, so you'll see like seaplanes, helicopters, all sorts of stuff sort of down here who want to do more local stuff. You'll see a lot of helicopters in this area. But yeah, that's the general sense of what the Skyline is. We do own in the Class Bravo 1,301 to 2,000, but typically you're going to keep people at 2,000 and 1,500 to keep that separation. So now I'm going to hop into VRC and sort of draw out some of the things. I'm going to start with just VFR Departures and ignore the Skyline for now, and then we'll move on to the Skyline route. So let's just say we're running the 4s. Let's say we got someone 4 left. I want to talk about sort of that phrase earlier that said keep them away from your IFR flow. So if you think about what our IFR flow is, we're going to have IFR arrivals coming in here on 4 right, and then IFR departures going sort of like this, for the most part, or like this. So let's think about a couple scenarios. So the first scenario would be, let's say someone wants to go, basically depart Newark through the Bravo and get out of the Bravo as soon as possible. So if someone doesn't want flight following, he doesn't want to worry about any of that, he just wants to go to the Bravo, instead of sending them up here towards Teterboro or kind of down where you have Bravo airspace, the easiest way to get them out of the Bravo would be something like a left downwind departure off 4 left. Make sure you keep them away from your arrivals flow, and then send them on like a 240 heading somewhere around here, starting like midfield or something. Someone heading towards this 1200 block. The only thing to note is you might see some traffic in the area because you do have Linden right here. So that's Linden right around here. And make sure you're giving traffic calls as needed because even though they're technically in your airspace, they're not in your portion of the Bravo. The Bravo only extends to down to 800 or 1,200 feet in these areas, so they can be under the Bravo and not talking to you. So make sure you're aware of that. But that's one of the easiest way, like a pop-out route, basically, if someone wants to leave the Bravo and get out of the Bravo as soon as possible. So that's one really easy way to do that. As you can see on basically any runway, it's pretty simple. If it's the 2-2s, you can kind of just send them on a right heading here. Make sure you're keeping away from any traffic in the area. But yeah, it's pretty simple to get a sort of pop-out route right there. But if we're thinking about, let's say we've got a VFR departure, I'm going to erase some of these and just keep the arrivals flow for now. Let's say we've got a VFR departure who wants to go, let's say northwestbound at 4,500, and they do want flight following today. So we know one, if we look at the Bravo airspace, it goes up to 7,000, or yeah, 7,000. So they're going to be talking with people, even if they didn't want flight following, they're going to be talking with people for a fairly long time with some approach controller. But they also did request flight following, so this means they do want to talk to an approach or departure controller at all times. Even though you shouldn't sort of mix them in with your IFR flows, one of the easiest way to achieve this is to emulate the IFR flow. So you could, if there was a break or you were just sort of sequencing them in, you could have them fly sort of the same flow. So a right 060, then around 1,500 to 2,000 feet, around 4 DME, give them a left turn, and switch them over to departure. So yes, this does go in the same area that your IFR flows are, but if you just think about the airspace around you, a couple of issues. If we're on, right now we're on the 4s, so we'd have the ILS 6 approach here into Teterboro. So if someone wanted to go to the northwest, you'd have to keep them below this flow if the weather was VFR, and you wouldn't own this airspace at all if it was IFR. So that wouldn't really be an option a lot of the time, especially if they wanted a higher altitude. And if you think about how typical IFR aircraft get around this and get above it, is they fly out to the east and fly out to the west, right? So we can do the same thing and emulate the same thing with a VFR aircraft, so they can bring them above Teterboro and just hand them off to departure as soon as possible. So typically, what I would do in a situation like this, right, they wanted VFR to the northwest, 4,500 with flight following, coordinate with departure, let them know they want flight following, and then just give them the 060 on departure until they're around 4 DME, about 2,000, right? The altitude is more important than the DME because unlike the Newark 4, they don't have a crossing restriction here, and we need to make sure they're above these arrivals. So focus more on the altitude than the actual DME that they're reaching, like these lines. Once you're around here, you could already, first of all, it's a VFR departure, so you are radar identifying them. It's not departure who's radar identifying them. So you're going to pick up the track, radar identify them, check their altitude if they call up. So if they just call up without an altitude, you have to make sure you tell them to say their altitude, confirm that it's within 300 feet of what you see on your display, and then all good. What you want to do here is make sure they turn left as they would any other IFR departure and contact departure. Before you do that, though, remember to send the track over to departure so they actually have so you actually transfer that identification to the aircraft, and that way departure could basically just take them like they would any IFR departure, bring them over the Teterboro flow, and get them out of the way, because it's easier for departure to get a VFR aircraft who's climbing higher out of the way of IFR, both Teterboro and Newark departures, than it is for you. So it's easier to just merge them with the IFR flow and let departure take care of it, as long as you coordinate it well. We can see it's less of a problem with Teterboro, but you could say the same thing for the 2.2s. Just bring them out here on a 190 and then back out on a 220. That's a bad drawing. Let me do that again for you. Like a 190 and then a 220. It's still going to be a lot easier. You could coordinate. Again, if they wanted to pop out, just a right turn over here would be super easy. And the 190 might be unnecessary, but you could coordinate runway heading. But if you don't want to spend the time coordinating, departure is busy, right? It's just going to be easier to have them emulate the IFR flow, especially if they want something higher or they want flight following. Now, let's say they wanted the Skyline route or something like that. Remember, they're not going to be talking to departure. So, first of all, it's all your discretion what you do with them. Let's talk about the 4s again. So, here we have an arrivals flow here, and then we just have a departure here. If they're on the 4s and they want to take off 4 left, then just a right crosswind departure is going to be pretty simple. Set them up towards the Statue of Liberty. We'll talk about the points on the Skyline route in a second, but just how we're getting there. That would be pretty simple on the 4s. Again, we talked about the 1-1s before, or actually not the 1-1s, just 1-1. But runway heading or something along those lines, direct the statue, is almost the same thing. Very simple, as long as you don't have conflicting traffic on either a departure off the 4s or arriving traffic on the 4 right. For the 2.2s, again, pretty similar. You could just make sort of a left crosswind departure, merge them in here. And for 2.9, again, you could just bring them around. You just have to make sure, depending on what runway you're using, because you could circle 9.2 from either way, and they could request a departure, or we could be somehow, for some reason, doing 2.9 straight up. But anyways, just depending on what your other flows are doing, you could bring them either to the left or to the right and bring them in here. Now, one important thing to note, when you're on the Skyline, if you're going to send someone direct to join, make sure you know the other traffic in the area. Because sending someone direct to the statue, let's say we're doing 1-1 right now, sending them direct to the statue works. If you make them do like a right turn right in here, right, they can just merge right in. But say you've got someone coming down from up here on the Hudson southbound, and then you have a departure over here going to the statue and then taking it northbound. This could become a conflict right in here. So just make sure you're cognizant of the other aircraft that are on the Skyline, if there are any. So now I just want to talk about the Skyline itself. So actually, I'm just going to zoom in here a little bit, just so we can get a better view of it. Just so you know, we're just going to show this for a second. The diagrams I have up in VRC are the Newark ATCT map, the New York class Bravo, and the coastline. If you don't have coastline normally, I would highly recommend it, especially when you're doing Skyline procedures, because it shows you a lot of where both the river is, but also some of the landmarks you should know. All right. So let's just take a screenshot right here and look over it. So the general airspace you're going to be looking at, or the general flow of where people fly on the Hudson is about this. And it continues going up here, but we'll just draw like a line right there. And sorry for my terrible drawing skills, but it's what we're stuck with. So this will continue up here into LaGuardia's airspace, but this is the airspace you own. And so I'm going to first mark some important places here, 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 and here. So this is the Verrazano Bridge, making sure I'm not misspelling anything. Verrazano Bridge. We have the Holland Tunnel, and we have the Lincoln Tunnel. And then over here we have the Statue of Liberty. So these are the main things I've marked. As well as this, you'll see the square over here. This is Governor's Island. So let me mark that. Governor's Island. So something, I'll show you this in a bit when we go back to the SOP, but something to note here, in the tower map, the tower diagram that I pulled up, the square is here over Governor's Island, but when you pull up the N90 video map for Newark, that N90 sector, the square over here is over the Statue of Liberty. So when you're looking at a video map or something like that and you're confused which one's which, just remember that the different ATCT versus N90 maps have different places and different like objects in different places. But these are the general points I like to use. You can use basically any visual point you can find on a sectional chart, on SkyVector, something like that. So feel free to use something that's non-standard. But these are the standard things, and I would say the Verrazano and the Statue of Liberty are the things most people can find. It's relatively hard to find the Lincoln Tunnel. The Holland Tunnel has more stuff out over the water, so I believe there's like a structure out over the water on each side, but I don't think there's the same for the Lincoln Tunnel. Could be wrong about that, but I believe you can see like parts of the not the Holland Tunnel itself, but where the Holland Tunnel is. But again, that's probably from people more familiar with the airspace, so I don't think every VATSIM pilot's going to know where these tunnels are. But the Verrazano Bridge is pretty obvious where it is, and same with the Statue of Liberty. Most people know where the Statue of Liberty is. So these are the best points, I think, to use. And remember, look, it's basically runway heading from runway 11. So we're going to talk about the flows on the Hudson. I'm just going to get rid of some of these and get rid of my horrendous drawing. Just imagine sort of the outline of the Bravo is basically where it's going to be in your airspace. So one flow that's going to come is you're going to get a southbound flow right here. And so this is going to be from LaGuardia Tower or whoever's covering it. And this typically, I'm going to put everything with a grain of salt here in terms of altitudes, typically at 2,000. This is what I like to run. Southbound at 2,000, northbound at 1,500. Again, it's not definite and it can change. Even IRL, it changes depending on the day sometimes. But I like to run southbound at 2,000, northbound at 1,500, just sort of you get that neon sweep and it keeps it consistent. But make sure if LaGuardia Tower is also online and they have traffic on the Skyline, make sure you coordinate, see what they're doing, because you're going to have problems if you run something different than LaGuardia Tower. But basically, they're just going to hand off the track here. So a couple things to note, they are already on the Skyline. I see a lot of new students, when they get people up here, they'll say like, proceed direct the statue, join the Skyline route southbound. You don't have to do that. They're already on the Skyline route southbound. So really when someone calls up here, if they don't have any requests, all you really have to give them is like the altimeter, and maybe any other, maybe a traffic call or something, if you have any other information to give them. Let's see here. Another sort of flow you're going to get in here is either uncontrolled or from Kennedy Tower. So uncontrolled / Kennedy Tower. And if they're uncontrolled, they're going to be at below, here, let me make this more clear, 1400 and below. So this is for uncontrolled people here. And this is because the Bravo extends down to 1500. So if someone's coming uncontrolled and then wants to transition up here, they're going to call you up short of the Verrazano here and call up basically saying we'd like clearance into the Bravo. They're coming from Kennedy Tower. They could be even down at 500 feet because of the South Shore. We'll talk about the South Shore in a little bit. Or they could be up around anywhere from that to probably like 2,000. It's up to Kennedy Tower's discretion, but once you get them, you can change this altitude. Basically, in most cases, you should give them a new altitude because unlike from LaGuardia Tower, none of them are going to be cleared onto the Skyline route. So typically, if you have an aircraft coming from down here, if we say they're uncontrolled, we're going to radar identify them. So give them a squawk code, ident if you need, radar identify them, confirm their altitude, all that good stuff. Once they're radar identified, you can clear them into the Bravo, and typically the instruction I would get, I see a lot of students giving someone what we give for like departures, so proceed direct the statue, join the Skyline route northbound. But if you see the route that kind of makes, say someone's down here, doesn't really make sense. It cuts in here, goes direct onto the other side. They're supposed to be sticking to the east side, remember, because they're driving on the right side, and then they have to merge back over on the east side. So if you have traffic coming southbound, that could be a problem. So really what I like to use is just the main reporting point over here. I would just say proceed direct the Verrazano, join the Skyline route northbound. So they'll go right here and just join right up here. So that's pretty simple. Again, if they have no other requests, they can just fly northbound. And then let's talk about what happens when they get up here. So if you have a guy going northbound, either from the Verrazano, or we have someone who comes off Newark and merges in here, up here, remember they're from LaGuardia Tower, so we're going to give it to LaGuardia Tower. So to LaGuardia Tower, and typically, and remember, this is not 100% of the time, but typically I like to use 1500 for northbound. So LaGuardia Tower, hand them off in between the two tunnels here, somewhere like that, wait for him to pick up the track, and you can hand them off. The only, for down here, they have a couple options, so let me get rid of all this clutter. So if they're coming down here at 2000, or it was off Newark and they merged southbound, basically somewhere before this, if they haven't said it already, you should ask for what they'd like to do after the Verrazano. So you could say intentions after the Verrazano, and so they have a couple options. They could dip below the Bravo, so go 1400 or below, and go over to Unicom. Another thing they could do is a lot of pilots like to, since they're already sort of getting a tour, they like to come over here and, like, remember we can get handoffs from Kennedy Tower. They like to go to Kennedy Tower for what we call the South Shore. So I'm going to illustrate what the South Shore is here in just a second. But these are typically the two options. You're either handing off or just dropping them out. They could technically climb up and go to an approach to controller, and that would either be that could be a multitude of different controllers. So it really depends on where they are in the airspace. It could be LaGuardia, it could be down towards Kennedy, depending on what the operations are at each airport. So that's something where you definitely have to coordinate if they wanted flight following, or another way you could do that is say contact Kennedy, get them over to another controller like Kennedy Tower, and then have Kennedy Tower coordinate it. It kind of seems like you're offloading it, but this is definitely a trickier airspace to get someone out for flight following. If they wanted to go up, let's say they wanted 3,500 flight following to Belmar down to the south, it's a lot easier to get them around here down to the shore and get them away from this busy area. Because look, this can be we could have LaGuardia arrivals coming in here, Newark arrivals or departures over here, and we could also have Kennedy arrivals over here if they're running the 1-3s or the 4s. I know it's a little bit off screen, but that's the general gist. So I'm just going to zoom out a little bit real quick and illustrate what I mean by the South Shore. So someone just finished over here. They're going over the Verrazano. They say, yeah, Newark Tower, after the Verrazano, anyway, we can get the South Shore. So that's something you'd have to coordinate. So you'd say, stand by, I'll ask Kennedy Tower. So then you go coordinate, you say Kennedy Tower, Newark Tower. Once they're ready, you just say, yeah, I've got a guy going southbound on the Hudson. He's getting close to the Verrazano. He'd like the South Shore afterwards. Does that work for you? As long as it's approved, right? You do all the coordination, anything you need. So if I was working Kennedy Tower, I'd probably say, yeah, that's approved. Just hand him off to me over the Verrazano, right? So then you'd give the track over here. Once he accepts it, you can just hand off the comms. And even though it's not a direct line of airspace between them, we allow for direct handoffs here. So if you've been to Kennedy, you know what this is. But typically, when someone's flying the South Shore, they're going to fly south of the shore. Pretty straightforward. And below the Bravo. So below 500 feet, especially if they're running either, ILS-4 right, or the 2-2s, and you have departures off 2-2 right, or even the 1-3s coming in here, or you could even have 3-1s departures, who would probably be above them here, but still just to be sure. So depending on the ops here, most of the time they're going to keep them below 500, but again, that's all Kennedy Tower's discretion. So basically, you're just going to keep them at 2,000 here, hand them off, and then they're none of your business anymore. The only last thing I want to mention on the Skyline route that a lot of people forget is no matter where they call you up, even if they're coming from another controller, like LaGuardia Tower here, make sure you give all new people entering the Skyline route the Newark altimeter when they call up, because they've been talking to other controllers at other facilities with different altimeters. So they were probably given either LaGuardia, Kennedy altimeter, or nothing if they're coming from Unicom down here. That should be it. I hope that was pretty comprehensive on the Skyline procedures. The only other thing I would add is if you have questions on the Skyline route, there is some information in here. There's also down in the Tracon section a video map with different other points. So like you can see them all down here. Just be warned, this is using the Tracon video map, not the tower one. But yeah, if you have any questions, look over these things. If you still have questions, you can ask in the Discord or email me or anything like that. And yeah, that's going to be it for the tower section. I'll see you next time in the Tracon section.